Okay, so it's 12:15. We will get started on today's webinar. Please note that when you enter the room, you are automatically put on mute. So at the end, when there's a question period, please be sure to unmute yourself. Also, this webinar will be recorded. So if you would rather to keep yourself off camera, not a problem whatsoever. So we just want to thank everyone for joining us for this month's iteration of our Business Process Intelligence webinar series. Today we're going to be speaking about maintaining business continuity post-COVID-19. Huge topic, so we really are only going to be scratching the surface of it today in our short time. But for those of you who aren't as familiar with us, we are EZSigma Group. We've been around since 2000. And we're very passionate about continuous improvement and specifically Lean Six Sigma for allowing people to and helping them to create more time by becoming more efficient, both in personal lives and in their professional life. And so for those of you who are interested in how we do this, we actually have a full 360-degree solution, everything from the software to the training, whether that's virtual, online, webinars. So we have the full package available. And then for today, we will be having Rod Morgan facilitate today's webinar. Rod was one of the original founders of EZSigma and has been a personal friend of mine for over 15 years. He's got a huge amount of experience all over the world and many different industries he's worked in. He's an absolute expert on the topic, and so I have no doubt that you will learn quite a bit from what he has to say today. So without further ado, Rod, I'm pass it over to you.
Well, thank you, Liz, and always check in. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, can hear you.
Fantastic. Okay, well, thank you, Liz and EZSigma Group, and most importantly, thank you for those people that are tuning in to today's session. We're going to be keeping it brief on a very, very big topic, which is what is business continuity and business continuity planning, and perhaps thinking of it in terms of the context of where we are today as a community, a global community, in fact, with the novel coronavirus pandemic, and a bit of a roller coaster depending on which countries you're in as to the different precautions and countermeasures that have been put in place that have been quite disruptive, both at a personal level, but also at a organization and societal level. So today we're going to cover off on what is business continuity, what are the best tools and resources for business continuity planning, how do we plan when there's so much uncertainty out there. These are just kind of guidelines in terms of our topics. We're not going to follow this to the letter of the law, but hopefully come out of this with a fairly good understanding of what business continuity planning is and some of the challenges in doing business continuity planning, or BCP, but also some of the tools and methods that might be suitable for you or to help enable you to better navigate the somewhat uncharted waters we find ourselves in. Liz, we had a quick survey I thought might be interesting. I'm not sure if you can pop that survey in for people to do right now. It's very, very brief.
Yep, just give me one moment and then I will pop it in. So,
So we had a small survey, 3 questions, I believe. There might even be 2. If you're hearing a bit of a chiming sound, it's people coming into the session. Just ask you to take a couple of seconds to be able to do this survey. I'll stop sharing my screen just in case, Liz, that's causing a problem for you.
we'll have to revisit the poll. My sincere apologies.
Oh, okay, that's okay. Well, worst case scenario, we'll talk about what the questions were at the end of the session. Okay, so that buys us a little bit more time. Let's first talk about what business continuity planning is, or BCP. Business continuity is an organization's ability to continue to manage their core functional business operations during as well as after a critical incident or crisis has taken place. And of course, one thinks of COVID-19, and that fits the bill perfectly. One thing that wasn't mentioned in the literature was the notion of emergency response plan, which is really a subset of business continuity planning. Many organizations and companies around the world, and families even, and communities were thrown into emergency response tasks and activities, probably without a clear sense of what their emergency response plan would be. So an ERP, not an enterprise resource planning system, but emergency response plan prescribes how to safely, effectively, and immediately respond to a disruptive incident. And that would be a subset of what business continuity planning is, which is much broader. It's the process of developing systems and recovery plans should a critical incident or a crisis take place. This process should be a key element in organizations' risk management strategy for identification, prevention, and recovery. So as you can imagine, business continuity planning is a really tough order of business in terms of being able to do it effectively. It is a lot of work and often is either ignored completely or is done, but not at the level required to be truly considered a business continuity plan. Let me just go back down here. So what a business continuity plan requires is really first establishing credible scenarios, identifying situations that can make it difficult or impossible for you to carry out critical functions of your business or your entire business operations as a whole. So this could include the loss of facilities, which in larger organizations with multiple footprints could either be partial or complete. As you can imagine, again, not beating it to death, but COVID-19 and the pandemic has had a complete impact on organizations, regardless of where they may be located around the world. Granted, there will be variation in the level of impact or response. It could also be the loss of information technology services or infrastructure, internal or external supply chain disruption, and of course, disruption to key personnel, both internal as well as external in terms of contracted resources. I borrowed this image from a website. It's parker.com. There's a link to it at the bottom, and it's also included in the resources identified at the end of this session. It includes a guide to business continuity planning for biomanufacturers. So although specific to that particular industry sector, it is still applicable across all organizations, regardless of whether you're private, public, and any industry sector whatsoever. But as you can see that this was written back in 2017, little did they know that we would be facing a pandemic this year. So viral outbreak, which is in the almost bottom left corner of that image, has been identified. But you see things like storm damages. I just spent a fair amount of time in the Caribbean on a wonderful assignment and actually lived through a hurricane that went through the region. So I got to see firsthand how the island and the different organizations on the island prepared for the oncoming storm. And so they did have a business continuity plan in place in some form or fashion. Was it adequate? Probably not. But there was, because this is such a routine, unfortunately routine occurrence, they also have history behind them in how to respond. It could result in, it would be the result of theft, a power loss or power disruption. If you think back to several years ago, many years ago, where we lost all of the power across the eastern seaboard for about 4 or 5 days, and some even longer. Mechanical failures, water supply disruptions or contamination, fire and other types of acts like that, human mistakes, cyber attacks, which is very much out in the industry today, something ransomware that we have to worry about, and finally, natural disasters like earthquakes. So all of these things can create scenario where your business is being disrupted in whole or in part. I also wanted to mention the ISO 22301 standard for business continuity. And again, there's a link to some resources in this presentation that you can follow up on later. ISO 22301 is applicable to all organizations, regardless of size, industry, or nature of business. It is also relevant for certification and regulatory bodies, as it enables them to assess an organization's ability to meet its legal or regulatory requirements. So as you can see in the image to the right, business continuity plans would include or take into consideration your supply chain, staffing, utilities, as well as critical equipment and infrastructure. So ISO 22301 is about security and resilience, business continuity management systems and requirements, and was published in 2012 and was recently revised or brought up to date with the latest thinking and best practices. There are two critical elements that are identified within ISO 22301. That is the buy-in for top management, which would apply to any strategy that an organization has. And of course, then a readiness assessment, being able to simulate business recovery exercises to assess what your current capabilities are, and then be able to start filling in those gaps. So a business continuity plan from a comprehensive assessment would first include understanding and mapping and documenting your current states. And that's the hard work, that's the heavy lifting, and often the thing that there are other urgencies, other things that are more important that take precedence. In fact, if anyone's familiar with doing ISO and ISO certification, it's a major undertaking of understanding how your organization operates, and it's documenting all of that information. So no one likes to do it. It's a necessary evil, and that's why it often gets overlooked with other urgencies, more immediate things that the organization looks for. Organizations that perhaps are in a reactive mode in terms of reacting to current state requirements, as opposed to proactive, looking down into the future and what needs to be done in terms of certain disruptions, in this case, for the business. So documenting your products and services, identifying from a lean perspective, lean manufacturing or lean services, core value streams, which include your supply chain that support those value streams. Facilities, the purpose and usage, the layout, and all of the supporting infrastructure that go into those facilities and footprint. Equipment, purpose, usage, equipment specifically used for products and services. Under facility, you would have already taken into consideration your HVAC systems and electrical requirements and plumbing and so forth. This equipment requirement is more about the products and services that you deliver, what the current capacity is, or the capacity that you need to be able to service demand, as well as all of the energy and utility requirements for that equipment. Of course, in today's world, information technology systems are so interwoven into everything that we do, including this session that we're having today. So networking and hardware, software, storage, all of that needs to be considered. And then finally, one of your most, if not your most important resource, your human resource, personnel, role, physical locations, what their current access requirements are to be able to do their job in terms of facility, equipment, as well as technology. Once you've got all of that current state assessed and documented, you then need to focus on identifying scenarios that could result in some form of business disruption. It should be very specific to be able to do these exercises correctly. What if this happens? Or when this situation occurs, how would it impact our business? And how would we be able to respond to it and mitigate it? A sample should include something that would be relatively minor, a localized incident. What would happen at this particular facility or in this department? Moderate, which would be a much more expanded view of disruption. And at the very far end, at the other bookend, you'd also want to take something like COVID-19 or a hurricane or a massive power loss, loss of a grid. And that would be labeled as something severe or catastrophic. The impact will vary depending on severity. So not all elements of the business will be affected to the same extent, and some may actually be spared completely because of what they do or where they're located. With those scenarios identified, you then prepare an initial matrix to be able to identify each element identified in your current state, how it might be impacted by each scenario. This might be something as simple as a subjective assessment, no impact, minor impact, moderate impact, or severe or catastrophic. And then describing what that impact would be in terms of the preceding elements that go into your business and how you do business. With that part of the assessment out of the way, then you need to start working with a team of subject matter experts to identify and brainstorm on recovery strategy options for each based on the assessed impact from each of the scenarios. This requires the evaluation of the effectiveness of each option versus current state operations. How quickly could we do this, and how effective would it be in terms of being able to restore our capability and capacity to do what we do? And then selecting, based on this assessment, recovery strategies that, of course, would require management approval. So that's the third element, to be able to decide on what would be the recovery strategy based on certain conditions. The fourth element then would be to develop a detailed business recovery plan based on those strategies. We need to be able to design a business continuity plan skeleton or framework, which would identify recovery teams, personnel, roles, people in lead positions. We would also develop relocation plans if they were required. I could, going back to my time in the Caribbean, we had different scenarios where we would have to move people, relocate to different areas of the facility. We would have to relocate people to different areas of the island. And the third option would be to remove or relocate people out of the island completely. So three different scenarios had to be considered, and then how that would be affected. A little bit like doing a fire drill, which all of us are familiar with. We then document our IT recovery plans and procedures. Resilience in the Caribbean is something that's on everyone's mind. It's a part of the daily lexicon. How do we develop greater environmental resilience? And one of the strategies, of course, with information technology systems is the cloud. Being able to move all of your data, move all of your systems into a virtual cloud environment, thereby getting rid of all of the physical hardware and backup locations for storage that you would normally have. So one of the key selling features, of course, with IT is to move to virtual and move to the cloud, being able to make yourself more resilient in terms of service disruption. We also then need to consolidate and verify the plan for effectiveness and accuracy, and ultimately, once again, obtain management approval for the plan. And it's not over yet. Then we have to start testing the plan and doing exercises, the equivalent of fire drills. And again, based on priority and the probability associated with each of the circumstances that might arise to service disruption or business disruption. We need to develop and test testing protocols and exercises and drills for each of the scenarios. We need to train the staff identified with each of the roles in each scenario. And then we have to selectively execute some form of testing or exercises for the drills that need to take place. We have to document and evaluate the results. What are our lessons learned? And be able to update policies and procedures as required. So the comprehensive assessment culminates in being able to continue to maintain the currency of our business continuity plan, because it is a living document and will become very quickly obsolete or redundant in some cases. Your business and environment in which it operates will change, and it seems to be changing more and more rapidly with every year. Your business continuity plan must change in step with how your organization evolves over time. So one of the reasons that we often get involved in business continuity planning is because Lean and Six Sigma and basic quality tools provide a vast amount of resources that are extremely useful when doing business continuity planning. I spoke previously about value stream mapping. If you're not familiar with it, it's an easily acquirable tool. If you're already involved in Lean, you already know what value stream mapping is. It provides from the moment of demand, customer demand, to demand fulfillment, everything that needs to happen, including supply chain partners and information technology systems and resources to be able to deliver and fulfill on that demand. So an ideal fit for business continuity planning in terms of both deciding your current state or determining your current state, but also envisioning what your future state might look like pre, during, and post disruption. Process flow mapping is always going to be an essential tool. Process flow maps fit into value stream mapping. Multiple process flows feed like tributaries into the value stream. Tools like Visual Workplace are not only essential for being able to maintain standards in the workplace, but especially with service disruption. How do we leverage Visual Workplace to aid people in their transition through an emergency response, for instance? Standardized work, of course, is incredibly important to understand what is the right way or best way to be able to do a certain task. You can imagine that if I had standard work in a kitchen to be able to, like a recipe, to be able to create a special dinner for the family, what would happen if I lost the kitchen and we had to prepare that recipe and deliver the food somewhere else? Standard work would change, but at least I have the original recipe and I can start looking at what would be the impact of this disruption on this particular recipe. Would it disrupt our supply chain? And if so, where would I get the basic ingredients I need to be able to do that recipe? If we lost our power, how would I be able to cook the food? What would be plan B? So standard work gives me a great base to be able to understand the current state, but also be able to assess what the impact of a particular disruption would be and what the standard work would be in a future state with that disruption being managed. One of my most, not one of my most, my favorite tool, especially in a service environment, is the failure mode and effects analysis, or FMEA. And maybe we can talk about that more once I get through this presentation in the Q&A section. When you couple a failure mode and effect analysis with a product, a system, an IT system, an HVAC system, a value stream, or a process map, it allows you to ask a series of very basic questions. What is the step of the process, or what is the component that goes into that part? What would be a failure of that particular component or step of the process? What would be the effect of that failure? What might cause that failure to happen? So in the case of a business disruption, if I plug into that what might cause a failure, it actually propagates what that failure would be. So back-ending into the FMA by identifying the particular failure mode, the disruption would actually propagate the different types of failures that I could expect to see. It also assesses how often might that happen. Is it rare? Is it a daily, hourly? What percentage of the time do we see that type of failure? And then finally, what kind of controls do we have in place to react to it? So the FMEA is a great risk management tool. And what better condition of risk than something as catastrophic as business disruption? With failure mode and effect analysis, we can also look at error proofing. Pokiyoki is the Japanese term for it. What sort of interventions can we put in place to eliminate that risk, mitigate that risk, be able to reduce the frequency of occurrence of that risk? And if all else fails, what sort of controls do we need to be put in place? What's our reaction plan? So take value stream mapping or process flow mapping and coupling that with FMEA and error proofing. What a wonderful tool set to have when dealing with business continuity planning. Of course, business continuity planning does require brainstorming and understanding cause and effect, and being able to rank and prioritize different types of failure modes and different types of disruptions and the magnitude of those disruptions. Another thing that's important in business is supplies, whether I'm manufacturing something, a product, or it could be a combination of product or service. It could be simply office materials and other things that we need to be able to do our business. The concept of Kanban and material management from a lean perspective fits well within the business continuity planning framework. And finally, what would be a perfect example of the need for rapid changeover or quick changeover? A business disruption is exactly that. How quickly, like Hydro One or Ontario Hydro, when we have a disruption of power, what are the things that go into play to be able to restore power as quickly as possible? In healthcare, for instance, the concept of rapid changeover applies to MRI units. From the moment that an MRI scan is completed, how long does it take until the next patient is going through that same machine getting scanned? That's where value is being created. So rapid or quick changeover is a principle that obviously applies to service or business disruption. How quickly, from the moment that this disruption occurs, can we transition into our emergency response plans to be able to create a stable state of productivity that carries us through the disruption until we can resume normal operations? So the good news is all of these courses are available through EZSigma Group. So there's a little bit of a plug. If you're interested in any of these, just contact Liz and see if the Lean program might be right for you. So let's talk about COVID-19 and the reality. And of course, I know there's a mixed opinion out there as to how severe this current situation is. Is it being overblown? I'm not here to debate that with you. This pandemic has presented a critical incident for the world like no other, with unknown reach and duration, worldwide implications, and no precedent to accurately base these projections. It is fair to say that we are very much in uncharted territory. I took that statement from BMS Canada Risk Services. They're based out in Ottawa, Canada. And the little image to your right, the notion of the preparedness, starting at the bottom, the response to disruption, the recovery, the prevention or mitigation. Prevention, think about error proofing. And then that circles back to preparedness. A little bit like a continuous improvement. Your business continuity planning is an evolving, living being. You have to continually maintain it, always going back to revitalizing it for the current state. COVID-19, or this magnitude of disruption, is not an ideal for a time for any management team to start focusing on developing complex business continuity plans. Many are just trying to navigate and stay afloat. But it is a time to consider the current disruption that the majority, if not all organizations, have managed, some better than others, to adapting to the current state. Business continuity planning may offer the opportunity to enhance your organization's recovery, leveraging the lessons we're learning and rethinking, and I challenge you to redesign and abandon old paradigms for your operating model, whether you're public service, information technology. Just to give you a sense of the people on the call today, we have people from construction, consulting, financial, food and beverages, government, healthcare, higher education, information technology, legal, as well as not-for-profit. Every single one of these sectors is affected by what's going on today. Some are benefiting. I mean, we do hear about it in the news that some organizations are leveraging this crisis, perhaps still doing the right thing, but also growing as a result. The demand, for instance, for Zoom and these types of virtual environments has skyrocketed. We know our firm offers both what was traditional brick and mortar in-class training and consulting services, All of that's moved to virtual offerings, unless there's a condition where we can deliver in a brick and mortar environment that's safe for all participants. So using online training, e-learning, self-paced, and combining that with very well-timed and well-scheduled virtual classrooms is the training model today. Many organizations struggling to migrate into that type of environment. But we are learning that this, if done properly, this type of education can be less disruptive and less costly for organizations and achieve better learning outcomes. So that's some learning that we need to bring back into the future state. We don't necessarily want to return to business as usual. I think even at a personal level, we're rethinking our values and how we want to be and how we will engage as we move out of this particular pandemic and crisis. We have enabling technologies that are being employed that can allow for more pull-based, that's a lean method, a lean term, allowing the customer to pull what they need when they need it in self-serve options for clients. Look at what's happening to food delivery. Look at what's happening with Amazon and other type of retail giants in terms of product delivery. We have the opportunity to rethink the workplace requirements, including our physical footprints and layout in light of newly discovered remote worker capabilities. We see organizations today already dismantling some of their office footprint, knowing that they will never fully go back to the way business was. So that's a lot for organizations to consider. So again, not a great time for doing business continuity planning, but definitely a time to think about recovery and how do we go back to a future state that is going to be very different than the current state we were forced out of. We need to continue to focus on critical business activities, stabilize our cash flows, access the financial and other resources we need to be able to meet business imperatives and service our customers. We need to be able to be more agile, remain or become agile, nimble and adaptable. As the situation continues to evolve, one must anticipate more changes will come, including the inevitable end of this pandemic. Few businesses were prepared for this, and that's why we wanted to do that little survey at the beginning, just to get your feel on there was two questions, how much has this disrupted your organization on a scale of 1 to 10? Maybe we can do it through the chat box, Liz. And the other question was, how would you assess the recovery or the transition that allowed your organization to continue operations? Did they do a poor job? Was it not so bad? Was it excellent in terms of their transition, with or without a business continuity plan in place? Effective process management tools, again, part of the basic quality and lean and a little bit of Six Sigma, are tools and methods that are essential from my perspective now more than ever. Process mapping, FMEA and error proofing, standard work. For those of you not familiar with some of these terms, 5S or 6S, visual workplace, those two are all about workplace organization, giving people what they need at arm's length to be able to do what they need to do without searching for the things they need. Visual workplace and 5S are essential frontline operations efficiency tools, if you will. But we also have to start looking at data more, process control plans, control being a synonym for stability. Are your processes stable? Do your customers receive a predictable experience? And then most importantly, are your processes capable? Not only are they predictable for the customer, but the customer always gets what they want. In manufacturing, we would say that we're meeting customer specifications, lower specification limit, upper specification limit, we're meeting spec. In the service environment, we could say we're meeting our service levels. So here are some of the resources that are available to you, and Liz will be providing these to you after the webinar so that you can actually do your own self-study. I wanted to talk a little bit just about business continuity planning as it relates to process control and stability. I suspect that some organizations have settled down into a stable or more stable state than the chaos that reigned when remote working had to be established and work was significantly disrupted. Imagine people in the manufacturing world, people working on an assembly line type of manufacturing where they're normally very closely grouped. How do we be able to provide a safe environment for them to work, prevent the spread of the virus, but at the same time be able to do so efficiently? Probably not operating at the capability that they normally would. Their throughput from a manufacturing perspective would be less. Their overall productivity would be down. And productivity, of course, applies to all industry sectors, regardless of manufacturing or services. When you're looking at your processes, think of it from a continuous improvement perspective. In continuous improvement, there are two things we try to do. And this is more going down the path of Six Sigma thinking and process variability. Your processes need to be in control and stable. Meaning, another simple way of looking at it is if I walked away from the process today and observed it tomorrow or next week, would it still be doing what it's doing right now? Is it predictable? Is it stable? Now, it doesn't mean that it's good. You can have a process that's predictably sucky, that's bad. The point is that it's stable. Before you start improving or changing a process, it needs to be in a stable state. Think about a patient going into an emergency department. What's the first thing we do with a patient? Do we try to fix them or do we try to stabilize them? And of course, the answer would be we stabilize the patient first. Trauma patients, patients at risk. We put them into a stable state. And once they're stable, then we move them through the care path to where we hope we can get them. We try to fix them. May not completely fix them, but we try to move them to whatever level of health, quality of life is possible based on their condition. That analogy applies to everything in the continuous improvement world. You can't fix something if it's not in a stable, controlled state. Business continuity planning and where we see ourselves today, in most cases, is not considered a stable state. Even though some organizations, think about restaurants, for instance, that are in hotspots in Ontario, where 2 weeks ago they had certain guidelines that allowed them to open their restaurants. And those guidelines have changed now, where they've had to once again close their doors to the public. So it is not a stable state. It's not in control. We are very much in a reactive learning mode as we move forward. So expecting an organization to do business continuity planning would be a very tall and probably foolish order to make. But that doesn't stop us from thinking about business process continuity planning. We need to start thinking immediately. We know there will be an end to this pandemic, ultimately with some form of vaccine available. We need to start thinking about an emergency response plan, which is really the bookend of the original emergency response plan. This ERP or emergency response plan has to be about how do we transition to whatever the new norm will be post-pandemic. That's going to occupy all of our energy at this point. However, once we arrive at that new norm, immediately we should be working on our business continuity planning, but only when that new norm is shown to be in control and stable. So that's a lot for me in a few slides, touching on the very surface of what business continuity planning is, emergency response plans, how this may relate to our current condition, as well as some of the tools that I consider to be very important when you're embarking on embarking on business continuity planning. So Liz, I'm going to pass it back to you, and we can open the floor to questions. I'd love to hear from people on how you're doing. you know, if you feel comfortable about it, this can be done anonymously, so you can put it in the chat session unless Liz gets the survey. One of the questions was on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being no impact at all, and 10 being catastrophic. How has the current COVID-19 pandemic disrupted your business? How much of an impact has it had? And another question would be on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being excellent response and 1 being abysmally bad response, would be how well has your organization transitioned in terms of effectiveness and speed to be able to adjust to the new operating conditions imposed upon us by COVID-19 and the novel coronavirus pandemic. So Liz, I'm stopping sharing. I'll pass it back to you. And I'd love for you to moderate and open the floor to any questions people might have.
Sure, thanks, Rod. So we did actually get some responses on the chat window, and it would appear that for the most part, there was a moderate disruption, a moderate impact from COVID-19. And when looking at the recovery, actually the majority is closer to the scale 8, 9 with the excellent recovery. So a few people had moderate recovery, and so far everyone that's responded has had a business continuity plan, which is fantastic. So we just want to give a couple moments to everyone if you do have a couple of questions. But as Rod mentioned, we do have some more programs coming up. We've got a couple more webinars that are scheduled this year. And we also have 2 micro courses that we are introducing, which is actually quite exciting. We're very pleased to offer that. One Rod mentioned is a FMEA fundamentals course, and the second one is process mapping tools and techniques. So the FMEA is coming up in November and the process mapping is coming up in December. So I'll just keep my mouth shut for a moment in case anyone has a question you'd like to take the floor. And for those of you that are considering getting your PMP designation, our sister company, Bay 3000, is offering a prep course, PMP exam prep course starting on Monday. And just as a side note, the PMP exam does change in January, so this could be your final chance to write the current exam. But if you have any questions about any of those programs, my email is on the screen. Feel free to reach out anytime, or you can contact us directly through our website. So Rod, it would appear there's no questions coming through, which means you did an amazing job of going through some business continuity planning. And so I trust that everyone was able to get at least some ideas, some renewed inspiration to get back to your BCP plans and move forward, especially as we're coming towards the end of the year. So
right. Liz, will everyone get a copy of these slides as well?
Yeah, we can send out a copy of the deck.
Okay, fantastic.
So thank you once again, everyone, for joining us today. It was a pleasure seeing some familiar names and some new names on the webinar. So once again, we would love to see you at our next webinar that's coming up next month. You should receive a notification for that. And if we can ever provide any additional services or training options, we would love to talk to you about it. So thank you, everyone, and have a great afternoon.
Thanks, everyone. Be well and be safe.